Oh, wow. They got quiet like the greatest deliberative body. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone here in-house to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated for those recording the program. We will post the program on the Heritage homepage within the next day for your future reference. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments addressed to an email address here at Heritage, speaker@heritage.org. Today we're featuring The Death of Deliberation, a discussion of the Senate and its political position in the United States and in our policy making. And I will call to your attention as well that we have flyers available on the book. They are especially important for those who want the discount code, which I will read for those listening online. You can use the discount code through the Lexington Book Company of LEX30, AUTH14, and that is available for anyone here too. So if you want to pick one up out in front for ordering and getting a special discount price on them, please do so. Hosting our guest today is Ed Corrigan. Mr. Corrigan is our Group Vice President at Heritage for Policy Promotion. Before joining us here last year, he served as Executive Director of the Senate Steering Committee, the Caucus of Conservative Senators, from 2003 to 2012. From 1991 to 2003, he served in various capacities, including Legislative Director in the office of Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Ed Corrigan. Ed?
Thank you, John, and welcome to Heritage. People say that Washington is broken and the Senate is always deadlocked. But Washington's not broken, and the Senate is not deadlocked. In fact, they're both working exactly the way the elites want them to work. The Senate easily clears enormous government-growing bills filled with crony handouts anytime those in power feel like it. Meanwhile, real debate and thoughtful consideration is pushed aside. Why is this? We've heard people fondly describe the Senate as the world's greatest deliberative body, but today such a description rings hollow. So how did we get from the days of Webster and Calhoun to where we are now? Our guest is uniquely qualified to help us answer this question. We are honored to welcome Dr. James Wallner to the Heritage Foundation to introduce us to his masterful analysis of the United States Senate, The Death of Deliberation. While the subject matter may sound depressing, I'm especially pleased to be having this discussion for a few reasons. James is not only a personal friend and a great friend of Heritage, he's operationally one of the most valuable assets the conservative movement has on Capitol Hill. James has worked on the Hill for over a decade. He served as legislative director to Senators Jeff Sessions and Pat Toomey, and today he fans the flames of revolution in his role as executive director of the Senate Steering Committee. But if living up to these responsibilities has been a high wire act, his success in academia is like juggling chainsaws at the same time. James has taught at the Catholic University of America since 2010, where he's now an adjunct professor, receiving his doctorate in political science in 2012. If studying decades of voice votes and unanimous consent agreements sounds dry, it's only as dry as a Marine studying the terrain for his next mission. A good rifleman shouldn't go into battle blind, and a good staffer shouldn't set foot in the Senate or the House or any governing body without researching the lay of the land. If we want to change America for the better, it's vital that conservatives understand the institutions in which we're fighting for better policy and the history of their legislative process and procedures. We can't be content to take orders and shout political cadences. We need to take a page from James's book and be scholars of our battlefield. Please join me in giving a warm Heritage welcome to the author of The Death of Deliberation, Dr. James Wallner. Well, thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to say thank you to the Heritage Foundation for hosting me today. I also want to thank Ed. He's not just for that wonderful introduction, but Ed's also been a mentor of mine in the Senate. I actually have the job that he had for a long time in the Senate at the Steering Committee. And he taught me the importance of procedure and understanding what's really happening in the Senate. So thank you for that. I also want to thank Kimberly, my wife, especially for her support as I wrote this book. It can be tough being a Senate spouse, but it could have been much worse.
You could have been married to someone who was fascinated by French or Italian cooking, right? But instead you lucked out, so you're welcome. I can talk about Senate procedure, Senate history, and the history of Senate procedure for literally days. So you're welcome. And if our soon-to-be baby girl is excited as I am, we may be running out. So this is the signal. So first of all, I think it is important to say that I think the Senate is a magnificent institution. More than any other branch, it reflects the genius of the American founders and the framers of the Constitution, I believe. I think the American people are incredibly lucky to have the Senate, even with all the trials and tribulations of the last few years. I think our job is to try to figure out how do we fix those. I also think it's worth saying that individual senators themselves are confronted with enormous challenges and responsibilities, and I actually stand in awe on a daily basis seeing how they deal with that. I've been fortunate enough to discover my interest in the Senate and to be able to study it academically. And I've also been most fortunate to have the great opportunity and privilege of working there professionally. The book, The Death of Deliberation, began in graduate school as my doctoral dissertation, and it represented my effort to reconcile what I read about the Senate with what I experienced there up close every day. And there's a disconnect that should be familiar to anyone who has worked in or with the Senate on a regular basis. There's this sense that outsiders just don't quite get it. My goal is to understand why this disconnect exists, and then to narrow the gap in what we think about the Senate and what actually happens there on the inside. So today I'm going to talk about how we think about the Senate. Now, around this town we often talk about ways to fix the Senate, but I believe it is first necessary to recognize how the Senate is broken before we can even begin to discuss ways to fix it. There is a prevalent view that should come as no surprise to many of you. I believe this is what I would call the conventional wisdom today. That is, the Senate is broken, period. The evidence is gridlock resulting from excessive minority obstruction. The culprit is ideological and partisan polarization, specifically conservative and Republican polarization. Just last week, President Obama at a fundraiser had a very interesting quote that I think strikes at this. He said, quote, "When you hear a false equivalence that somehow, well, Congress is just broken, it's not true. What's broken right now is the Republican Party that repeatedly says no to proven, time-tested strategies to grow the economy, create more jobs, open up opportunity to all people." This, I think, captures very well the prevalence of the conventional wisdom and its view that the Republican Party seems to be the problem. The Senate is broken, and it's broken that dates to the Reagan Revolution in the 1970s and early 1980s, the Republican Revolution in 1994, and the rise of the Tea Party in 2010. These events, for those who espouse the conventional view, each signified a further radicalization of the GOP base. The result is that more radical candidates were elected to the Senate, where they exploited their considerable procedural prerogatives once there to obstruct, quote, common sense solutions, end quote, to pressing problems. Today, the problem is not just a few outliers, again, according to the conventional view. Instead, it is that the majority of the party and its leaders are wanting to obstruct literally everything. Mann and Ornstein, that's Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein, they're one of the most prolific, some of the most prolific authors of the conventional view out there. They argue that the current obstruction represents a conscious and deliberate strategy on the part of the Republican leadership. Majority Leader Harry Reid has described Minority Leader Mitch McConnell as, quote, the proud guardian of gridlock, end quote. The result of this is that nothing gets done in the Senate. The Senate is broken simply because it does not pass important legislation. Just as an aside, I would say that important legislation within this view is almost always defined as measures or proposals that expand the size and scope of government, and hardly ever defined as proposals that restrict or limit the size and scope of government. But that's another discussion for another day. The result from all of this, well, I should say, the result is that nothing ever passes, nothing ever happens. But the Senate has not always been broken. There was a golden age, again, according to the conventional wisdom, before the conservatives came to town, where regular order governed the legislative process. Senators exercised restraint, and they did not regularly exploit their procedural prerogatives to obstruct. The result? The Senate passed important legislation. And lastly, the implication is that the Senate can be fixed. All we have to do is return the Senate to the golden age. How? We have two options. We can elect fewer uncompromising conservative Republicans, translation, elect more Democrats or compromising Republicans, or, barring success with the electoral route, we can change the Senate rules to reduce the ability of a minority of anti-government conservatives to obstruct. If we do either one of these things, the Senate will work once again. Important legislation will pass that is currently stymied and blocked by irrational or illegitimate obstruction. I believe that well encapsulates the conventional view. But setting aside a more political discussion over what bills the Senate ought to pass, I think we should first consider whether or not the Senate is actually gridlocked in this way. It should come as no surprise to you that I have a different interpretation. I believe that it is necessary that we first correctly diagnose the problem. And doing so requires recognizing that the Senate does in fact work on occasion. Important and controversial legislation still passes. Some examples from recent history: TARP in 2008, the $800 billion stimulus bill in 2009, Obamacare in 2009, Dodd-Frank financial regulatory reform in 2010, the Budget Control Act with a 2011 debt ceiling increase, the fiscal cliff deal in the first days of 2013, and comprehensive immigration reform in 2013. Some of these passed with large bipartisan majorities, and most, if not all, passed without supposedly polarized senators using all of their procedural prerogatives to obstruct things with which they disagree. The explanation offered for these developments or these bills passing by the conventional wisdom, I believe, is insufficient. To the extent it's even acknowledged, periodic success is almost always attributed to extraordinary factors that enable a few courageous senators and individuals to rise above the Senate's institutional flaws. That is to say that legislation is successful in spite of the Senate, not because of it. I believe that this leaves us with an incomplete understanding of the Senate. For one, it does not explain why some senators do not behave the way that we think they ought to behave when considering controversial legislation on the Senate floor. So gridlock certainly happens. I'm not denying that. The Senate is certainly more polarized today. The parties are much more cohesive, and data suggests that the Senate is less efficient today. We're passing fewer bills, and we're voting on fewer amendments. But the important thing is that gridlock does not always happen. It doesn't even happen when we think it should happen. Significant and controversial legislation continues to pass. And the conventional wisdom has difficulty explaining how these things pass despite high levels of opposition both inside and outside of the Senate. Moreover, instances when these bills pass exhibit similar procedural features. Senators typically grant unanimous consent to facilitate the consideration of bills and amendments that they oppose. Interestingly, the decline in bills passed, because there has been a decline, closely tracks the decline in bills considered on the Senate floor. The translation is that the Senate is passing fewer bills today because it is considering fewer of them on the floor, not because of minority obstruction once on the floor. Indeed, the percent of bills that are brought to the floor that ultimately passed has increased. The number of bills that brought to the floor that ultimately pass has increased. At the beginning of the current Congress, a bill was more likely to pass if it received floor consideration than it was 4 decades ago in the Senate's golden age. So for me, the riddle is that in the absence of changes to the Senate rules that enable minority obstruction, that were taught by conventional wisdom, that are the problem, minority acquiescence to the majority agenda that they oppose, this polarized majority agenda, cannot be assumed in this polarized environment. Something else must be explaining this. So instead of explaining why gridlock happens, which again is what most in this town try to do, the more important, and at least to me, the more interesting question is why gridlock does not happen. And this is my goal in the book, to systematically explain instances in which the Senate works. And doing so helps narrow the gap between what I experience working in the Senate with what I've read about the Senate and what I've studied about the Senate. So my argument in the book is essentially that the conventional wisdom is too simplistic. The most prevalent description of the Senate is that the majority will use all of its tools at its disposal to pass its agenda for policy and/or electoral gain, and that this leads to gridlock because the minority party will use all of its tools to obstruct the majority for policy or electoral gain. And this is reflected, we are told, in the rapid and dramatic increase in cloture motions and the dramatic increase in the routine practice now of filling the amendment tree to block senators from offering proposals on the floor. The argument is that the Senate cannot overcome this gridlock due to the persistent polarization in its environment and the supermajoritarian nature of the institution. The Senate is broken. This is the simple explanation that we're given. And we have a choice. We can either end the polarization or we can change the supermajoritarian nature of the Senate that allows individuals to obstruct. I find this explanation inadequate. It overlooks the nuances in how the Senate actually makes decisions. And in reality, the Senate is much more complex. And this is really frustrating to journalists and academics, policy observers, all kinds of people, because we are the ones in this town who are supposed to have the answers, right? There's always supposed to be a concise explanation. There must be something that explains what's happening. And then we can take that, we can derive a theory from it, and we can use it to predict future behavior. Well, the reality is that the Senate decision-making is messy, and it's reactive. I think one of the most descriptive quotes of the Senate that best gets at this dynamic was actually from the late Senator Ted Kennedy. And he referred in his memoir to the Senate as a chemical place. And he writes, quote, "Something happens when senators are all in the room debating an issue, especially when everyone understands that we are going to stay in and not adjourn until we get things done." I believe, and I write, that this chemical process is reflected in the Senate because the institution changes the manner in which it makes decisions on a case-by-case basis in reaction to conflict between its members. In short, the Senate adapts. Put another way, the legislative behavior of senators is patterned, and the dominant pattern exhibited on the Senate floor at a particular point in time changes in reaction to external and internal developments. The Senate has developed several patterns of making decisions throughout its history, the catalyst being a bipartisan desire to maintain legislative productivity in the presence of new forms and levels of conflict. New forms of legislative behavior reflect the innovative utilization of existing procedures, and that this is preferred, it has been the preferred course up until now, because it enables the Senate to adapt to changes in its political environment without changing the institution's rules. Because changing the institution's rules is cumbersome, it usually lacks a consensus, and the trade-offs are not always clear. So, to get to the actual Senate, over the past 100 years, the Senate has exhibited, I believe, 4 basic patterns of making decisions, 4 basic patterns of legislative behavior, 3 of which have been recognized either explicitly or implicitly by Senate observers. The first pattern I'm going to discuss today is called norms-based decision-making. It's what I label norms-based decision-making. This is something we no longer see in the Senate. It's a nostalgic view. It biases the conventional wisdom, in my mind. It largely defines how we think the Senate ought to operate. And this describes the mid-20th century Senate of Lyndon Johnson. Its characteristics are cultural norms of behavior that restrain senators from regularly exploiting their procedural rights on the floor. Things like a norm of apprenticeship or deference to seniority, specialization or a focus on one's committee work, courtesy and reciprocity towards one's colleagues, and institutional patriotism or the belief that the Senate is, quote, the greatest legislative body in the world, end quote. The legislative process in norms-based decision-making is dominated by committees and chairmen, and the Senate floor is a secondary location, and party leaders are secondary actors. As I said, this pattern is no longer observed in the Senate today. The next 2 patterns that I'm going to discuss, the next 2 patterns of legislative behavior, align with the 2 opposing poles of the conventional wisdom. On one hand, you have what I term collegial decision-making. This is observed today, but it is increasingly rare. And there are 3 factors that undermine norms-based decision-making in the 1960s and 70s and facilitate this rise of a more collegial process. They are, first, a new group of members, particularly liberal Democrats from the North that came in 1958 and 1964 elections. These members are more liberal than the members they replaced. They're less willing to defer to norms. They're less deferential. They're frustrated with the dominance of the Southern Democrats on committees. And as a result, they become more active on the Senate floor. These new members experience a new issue agenda. more controversial issues are joining civil rights legislation and other legislation in the Senate and on the agenda. And they want to be active in it. The Great Society agenda is beginning to unfold. Government is expanding. It's impacting people's lives. And so members actively want to participate in the process as a result. And similarly, you see a growth in outside groups, both interest and advocacy groups. They're growing along with the issue agenda, and they're seeking champions to represent their cause. They're offering resources to members who want to participate in the process on the floor. And so reflecting these forces, the legislative process, according to the collegial pattern, is going to be a deliberative and bipartisan process. Important decisions will be made in committee and on the Senate floor. Legislation will be openly debated and amended on the floor, but only after the Committee of Jurisdiction has considered it. And the primary actors are pretty much everybody, right? The committee chairs are going to be responsible for the substance of the legislation. Party leaders are going to focus on helping to keep things moving. And then individual senators are going to participate on the floor to the extent they want. The consequence is that the legislative process is very decentralized. Members face limited constraints on participation and debate and offering amendments, and cloture is very rarely needed. Vote outcomes reflecting this on both amendments and final passage of legislation are generally bipartisan. And as I said, this is still observed in the Senate today, though increasingly rare. Examples are, up until recently, the annual defense authorization bill in the Senate or the annual appropriations bills. These are things that are typically considered via a collegial process. Within collegial decision-making, party leaders are beginning to become influential. Up until this point, the committee chairs are the most influential actors in the Senate, but party leaders are beginning to become influential. They provide order to the floor deliberations. They focus on facilitating the participation of interested members in the legislative process. I think in describing this, it's helpful to juxtapose the leadership of Lyndon Johnson, with which we should all be familiar, with that of Mike Mansfield, which is also one that we should all be familiar with. We're often led to believe that these two differ because somehow Johnson was a better leader than Mansfield, or somehow Mansfield was weaker than Johnson. And that in reality, Senate leadership should be a constant. But that's not the case. And this focus on how the Senate makes decisions draws our attention, draws our focus to how leadership changes based on the environment. Lyndon Johnson presided over the Senate. He was the majority leader in the Senate during the 1950s, in a completely different era when Mansfield presided or led the Senate in the 1960s and 1970s. Johnson was a leader when the Senate considered things primarily by norms-based decision-making. The legislative process rested on a different foundation. It rested on a foundation of cultural norms. It rested on a foundation of committee chairmen and strong political actors that limited the participation of members in the process. Johnson was able to exercise the leadership he was in part because of that. He was also brilliant in many other ways in terms of transforming the office of the majority leader, but we cannot overlook the fact that what allowed Johnson to be Johnson in many respects begins and ends with this norms-based pattern of decision-making. It was a different Senate. In contrast, Mansfield has a completely different environment. Mansfield's authority rests on a much more diffuse source or foundation, and that is individual senators. He can't run the Senate like Johnson. Johnson, I would believe, and this is no way to tell, but I don't believe Johnson could run the Senate in the 60s and 70s like Johnson ran the Senate in the 50s. And so Mansfield recognized what makes Mansfield during this period so brilliant but he realizes the only way to lead the Senate is to get out of the way, to provide almost no leadership at all. And he focuses on facilitating the participation of members in the process, something that Byrd continues both as whip and then eventually as majority leader in the late 70s. And party leaders are able to focus on this because the two parties weren't necessarily always in conflict. It is unlikely that the majority party could reach a consensus within its own ranks to even begin to figure out ways to limit the participation of the minority. And it was unlikely that the minority party on most issues could unite to a sufficient extent to obstruct the majority on a consistent basis. Now, there are limitations to making decisions this way, and these limitations speak to the rise of the next pattern that I'll discuss. And these are primarily that it's time-consuming. It's difficult to limit conflict in this process, a collegial process, when more polarized issues come onto the agenda and parties begin to become more cohesive. And so this gradually leads the Senate to embrace more centralized procedures. The other pole, if you'll remember, there's two poles here. Either the Senate works or it doesn't. The other pole is majoritarian decision-making. And this is the legislative process that we typically reference today when we say the Senate is broken. And again, we see parties becoming more cohesive at the end of the 1970s and throughout the 1980s. You see a better sorted electorate. You see new issues come onto the agenda that divide the parties against each other and begin to transcend the jurisdiction of individual committees. And so these things help facilitate the development of the majoritarian pattern. The Senate is struggling with how it makes decisions, and it's trying to figure out a different way. It's trying to figure out a different way to pass legislation that it thinks it ought to pass. So within the majoritarian pattern, the legislative process is characterized by a very partisan process. The majoritarian pattern reflects the use of Senate procedures by the majority party to limit the participation of the minority. Important decisions are made in the majority party conference. Legislation bypasses the committees of jurisdiction and is placed directly on the Senate floor for consideration. The primary actor is the majority leader, or the majority party leadership. And as a consequence, the legislative process is very centralized. Members face significant constraints in participation. They aren't able to offer amendments, and very often debate is truncated. Cloture is critical in the majoritarian pattern. It's very important. And it's used to preemptively to speed the consideration of the agenda, typically regardless of whether or not we see minority obstruction. And this contradicts the conventional wisdom, which equates cloture votes with minority obstruction. The reality is that the Senate majority precipitates obstruction by its use of these majoritarian procedures. You may ask, why would they do that? Why would they lead the minority party to obstruct them? Well, there's several advantages that are offered by cloture that are often overlooked. In fact, I think it's important to realize that cloture was originally conceived as a tool to limit the minority party. It was conceived as a tool to empower the majority. Cloture serves as a scheduling mechanism. It expedites floor consideration. It restricts amendments. And I think most importantly, at least for this year, it sets up symbolic votes, or take it or leave it propositions. We read, I guess, a month and a half ago now that the agenda, the election year agenda of Senate Democrats was to provide a contrast, to set up as many as these take it or leave it proposition votes as possible using cloture. Senator Schumer says, to quote, "We want to work with our colleagues, but we're also going to make crystal clear whose side each party is on. Democrats are fighting for a fair shot for everyone, while Republicans are doing the bidding of the Koch brothers, the wealthy, and huge corporations. That's the distinction we will draw in November." Well, they're not able to draw that distinction without cloture. Vote outcomes on amendments and legislation in the majoritarian pattern are going to be highly partisan. But again, there are limitations in how the Senate can make decisions using the majoritarian pattern. It is difficult to sustain on a consistent basis, and this is because the supermajoritarian nature of the Senate means that the majoritarian pattern can only approximate majoritarian procedures as we commonly think of them, right? You can't have a process like the House and the Senate because of cloture, which I just said it empowers the majority, but it also restricts them in important ways as well. But the supermajoritarian nature of the Senate inhibits a fully majoritarian process. The majority leader has to go to the minority, typically, to get the votes to invoke cloture. And he also has to maintain as much unity within his own party as possible. So the procedural features of the majoritarian pattern, when used on a consistent basis, cannot accommodate the inevitable demands of individual members to participate in both parties. So, and we're currently seeing that now as well. We have the energy efficiency bill that was basically pulled from the floor after a failed cloture vote, and most recently a tax extenders bill, where the majoritarian pattern failed. This is it. This is where the conventional wisdom, as I see it, stops. The Senate's broken or it works. We have a choice. But in reality, this isn't an either-or proposition. The Senate still passes stuff. It's not a question of a collegial, wide-open, inclusive process versus a very partisan, closed majoritarian process. The Senate has increasingly exhibited different behavior than these two patterns when it's considered controversial legislation over the past 15 to 20 years. So in the book, I grouped together this new behavior, and I call it structured consent. This is how the Senate does the difficult today. And this is the logical choice for both the majority and the minority in the current environment. If you'll remember, the individualism inherent in the Senate restricts the majority's ability to pass bills on a consistent basis using the majoritarian pattern. It can't do it. So it has a choice. Do I go back to the collegial pattern with the wide open, never-ending process of floor deliberation and amendments, or do I go and try something else? They're going to try something else, and that's structured consent. It's certainly more attractive to them than the collegial process. Similarly, the minority has a choice. When confronted with the majoritarian pattern, they aren't allowed to participate. They would prefer the collegial process, but at the end of the day, if the majority is not going to go there, they were going to try to get the next best thing. That's structured consent. So the legislative process in structured consent is characterized by a bipartisan process. Important decisions are made during informal negotiations between the majority and the minority leadership, where agreement is reached and the process is prearranged on the Senate floor. The primary actors are the majority and minority party leaders, and the consequence of that is that the process is very centralized, although not as centralized as the majoritarian pattern. Cloture is needed, but the requirements of cloture are often set by unanimous consent. That is to say, 60-vote thresholds are typically stipulated in unanimous consent agreements for final passage on bills or the adoption of amendments. And vote outcomes are typically partisan for any amendments and typically bipartisan for final passage. So that's great that we make decisions this way in the Senate, but there's still limitations like anything else the Senate does. First, structured consent does not perform the informative role of the legislative process very well. The legislative process serves as an information revelation mechanism. It's a fancy way of saying that it typically reveals very important information on the resolve of individual members to get what they want. How hard are you willing to fight something versus how bad do you want something? Important information in structured consent, however, typically remains unclear until the end of the process, when leaders reach agreement on both the policy and the process by which it will be considered. This leads to a very disjointed process that exacerbates conflict. In a high-stakes legislative battle, you have one action that begets a reaction, which begets another reaction, which makes the environment more contentious. And this makes it more difficult for the two leaders to negotiate agreements. It leads to frustration among the Senate membership when structured consent is used on a repeated basis. Structured consent is also dependent on cohesive parties. The two leaders have to get support for the agreements they reach with one another from their parties. If they can't get their members to agree on a course of action, they can't ratify that with a unanimous consent agreement. So if you don't have a cohesive party or a party that is grouped around two opposing wings, you can't get an agreement. And lastly, structured consent is dependent upon a working relationship between the majority and minority leaders. The two leaders are virtually the only thing responsible today for ensuring that the Senate works. And so when that relationship deteriorates, as it's doing right now, the result is that nothing happens. We have gridlock. Structured consent isn't able to work. And the majority will pivot back to a majoritarian pattern as the next best thing it can get. Yet I would argue that must-pass legislation will still be governed by the structured consent pattern. So finally, is the Senate really broken? I believe that deliberation is no longer characteristic of floor action, particularly when major legislation is considered. Admittedly, true deliberation will never occur on the Senate floor under any circumstances. Some decisions will always be made elsewhere out of public view. Yet the Senate floor no longer represents an arena for spontaneous and organic decision-making. Instead, floor action is almost completely managed and controlled by the party leadership. The important decisions are increasingly made elsewhere. The reason is that the Senate adapts, and the development of the structured consent pattern represents a continuing adaptation of the Senate to its environment. Forces external to the Senate would likely lead to gridlock and polarization if it didn't adapt. But there are consequences here. One, pivotal players remain unclear. Absent party leaders, it's very difficult to see who the most important people are in this process. Number two, the opaqueness of structured consent obscures the inflection points in which the legislative process may be influenced. Members, their constituents, and groups may not know where best to direct their efforts to influence legislative outcomes. Once the legislation has made it to the floor, it may be too late to influence the outcome because the process has already been structured in such a way as to secure the bill's passage. This gives rise to an accountability problem, I believe. When the most consequential decisions are made behind closed doors, voters are often unable to effectively participate in the process. And assigning responsibility for outcomes is not easily done. This leads to disillusionment and cynicism because the public cannot observe that their claims are being adjudicated. And policy outcomes may differ from what they've been led to expect. So again, is the Senate really broken? I think framing the discussion in this way raises an important question that cuts to the core of the debate we should be having, which is the transformation of the Senate into a more centralized, restrictive, and partisan institution a negative development if such change is needed to maintain its legislative productivity? Now, certainly some would argue that the Senate still is inefficient, right? We have structured consent, great, but we can't pass these really important bills that we need to pass. But this is a question of ends, not means. And recognizing it as such allows us to question whether or not an activist institution is appropriate for our political system as established in the Constitution. The framers gave two functions to the Senate. One, passing legislation along with the House. But two, simultaneously checking the House by promoting deliberation in the legislative process. Passing legislation was certainly important, but it was not the only important function the framers gave the Senate. They gave just as much attention to the necessity of deliberating intemperate measures. And the bicameral structure of Congress and the Senate was perceived by all the framers to be the best method to preserve individual liberties by checking popular opinion and its corollary of expansive government without undermining the Republican principles on which the Constitution rested. And it is in this sense that the contemporary Senate can be seen to be broken. While it continues to produce important legislation at relatively consistent rates despite a rapidly changing environment, it has done so largely at the expense of the Senate's deliberative function. So reforms to reduce the procedural rights of senators to obstruct in order to expedite the passage of bills will not address this deeper problem. Any prognosis for reform must start from this realization. Failure to do so will simply result in our continuing to treat the symptoms of the underlying disease instead of curing it. Thank you.
James has agreed to spend a little time answering some questions. If you could please use the microphones for our online audiences. You got a question over here?
My name is Joel Mandelman. Offer a premise. Whether without ending majoritarian rule, all special interest groups will always prevail over the general goodwill, whether it's ethanol subsidies or sugar quotas or anything else, because you can always get somebody to filibuster it, reforming it. Second, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid need to be reformed, and that cannot, as a practical matter, ever happen unless you have majority rule in the Senate, meaning debate ends when 51 senators want it to end, not 60. I'd like your comment on that in light of everything that you've been saying.
Well, thank you. And first, I would say I'm not denying that there are certain problems within the Senate for both political parties. That's not my point or my goal here. My goal is simply to explain what I think has not been explained by the conventional view, by the prevalent view, which is how the Senate actually operates when it does, in fact, operate. There's certainly still challenges. And, you know, I'm not going to sit here and speculate about what's the best way to do that. That's typically, you know, that's above my pay grade. So I would just leave it at that.
Terry Campo used to be Senate Judiciary. Isn't part of the situation in terms of the Senate, though, also that you have the parties are now ideologically divided, not because of the sorting out within the regions?
That's certainly the case. I mean, the parties are more cohesive today, it seems. The data is clear. And the regions have certainly become better sorted. But even so, the Senate still manages to pass important legislation, right? The parties come together. Ideologically polarized senators refuse to use all of the tools at their disposal in a way that we are taught that they do use them or should use them to obstruct things with which they disagree. And so that's the riddle I'm trying to unlock or solve or answer.
This is just an observation. When I listen to debates in the British House of Commons, or I read debates from the Senate in the 19th century in this country, I'm struck by how people express themselves in complete sentences and even complete paragraphs. I find Americans more and more are less able to express themselves that way. And I'm wondering if there's something in our education or media addiction, or what is it that in my view, it seems hard to imagine these people really having a real debate or real deliberation, but let's just sort of reading, sound bites and stuff. Do you agree with that observation, or am I off?
I would say as a congressional staffer, it would probably be inappropriate for me to sit up here and speculate on the state of American culture and our education system. And so I'm going to stick to, factual-based questions about Senate procedure.
I'm Brian Riley from Heritage, and you've given a very in-depth history, kind of getting to where we're at now, how things are working. And I wondered if you would have any speculation or recommendations of how things might change depending on the outcome of elections this November.
Well, regardless of what happens in November, the Senate either has to figure out a new way of making decisions, or it has to fall back on one of the ways that I've outlined, right? I mean, that seems clear. That may seem too simplistic, but that's the best answer I can give. I'm not sure what happens. Minority Leader McConnell has certainly given a lot of, he's given some speeches about the way he would run the Senate, which is very different than the way that Majority Leader Reid has decided to run the Senate. And so the Senate will continue to adapt to its environment as it moves forward. But there's a lot of frustration right now, as you can imagine. And I think a lot of senators on both sides of the aisle, it seems to me, are very interested in finding a new path forward from where we are now.
If the Republicans got back control of the Senate, do you think they would change the rules back the way they were before the nuclear option was exercised? Or would they, now being in the majority, want to keep the advantage that Harry Reid now has?
I might go back and answer the question about education before I go there. Yeah. In addition to the time constraints in writing a book while you work in the Senate, there are certain other limitations as well. And so I would probably not answer that question.
Dr. Wallner, thank you very much for speaking. This was incredibly informative and very in-depth. My name is James Holland. I also work in the Senate, and I have a question. A feature of the structured consent, and it may answer this gentleman's question over here without stepping on any landmines. The actual nature of the debate, whether it be in sound bites for TV or tweets or what have you, the nature of the structured consent, the debate is, would you say, less important, what you actually say on the floor, since sort of the fix is in? Is that the nature of the structured consent? Or?
I mean, the floor is dominated by prearranged colloquies, scripted speeches. The important action's not happening there. In fact, nothing unplanned happens on the floor, it seems, anymore. The important stuff happens off the floor in negotiations between the two leaders and then a changing cast of characters of extremely interested senators. And this is the problem with structured consent, because we don't know who those people are unless you are literally in the room. Even other senators in both parties may not be aware of what's happening and what the level of negotiations is happening, right? And they don't know what to expect until it happens. And so as that's occurring, it leaves a vacuum that is filled on the outside on the in the media and on Twitter and in the newspapers and everywhere else in all of our groups and everything that constantly escalates. And while this negotiation is ongoing inside, and then an agreement is reached and it comes out and they unveil it And it's typically received increasingly today with a lack of enthusiasm. And there's a reason for that, and as I outlined before, it's because people can't participate. They're not allowed to get a sense that their claims are being adjudicated.
I'm Diane Katz with Heritage. Oftentimes, the success of either the House or Senate is communicated in terms of the numbers of bills that have been passed. Among some of us, at least, I think there's a great success in things that are stopped. And so I'm wondering if if you think there's a different way for us to address what success means, or you know, an effective chamber means, other than bills passing.
I think that'll certainly change depending on who you are and where you stand. It's frustrating, but to me, success for the Senate, what does a successful Senate look like, is basically, does it or does it not fulfill the functions that the framers assigned to it? And that may seem to be a very high threshold at first, a very complicated threshold, because there's all of these conflicting arguments that are expressed in the Philadelphia Convention and the ratification debates, and certainly over the years. However, there is one or two consistent functions that have come out from those debates, and that is the ability to pass legislation to address our problems. But number two, to kind of slow things down a little bit, to make sure that what we're doing is the best thing, that it's what we ought to be doing, and it's not some temporary or fleeting passion. And so I think as long as the Senate is performing those functions, then you get into arguments about whether the legislation that's passing or isn't passing is appropriate, and that gets into a political or philosophical argument over what government should or should not be doing. But I think the first two are kind of objective criteria, that regardless of whether you be a liberal or a conservative, it seems clear to, and you go back and you read the debates of the convention and the ratification debates, and again, the kind of broad history of the Senate, it remains clear that these things are pretty much agreed upon up until very recently. And now we have this checking mechanism kind of receding. And we only evaluate the Senate by the first function.
Yeah, I wonder how much the senators actually know each other, even they belong to the same party. I remember once, by the way, I'm Sasha Gong from Voice of America. Once I attended Ron Paul's coffee, that's during the government closed down, and the senators went there and introduced themselves to each other, say, I'm so-and-so from which and which state. I said, my God, these people are supposed to sit there, work together every day. They don't know each other. It's sort of a little surprising, because I remember when people describe Johnson, and the Johnson knows every single name in the Senate, and they went to dinner together and drink together. And is that something happening much less in the Senate now, and do they actually know each other, these people?
Well, I can only speculate as to the level of personal relationships. I will say, though, and regardless of what party they're in or what their worldview is, individual senators are incredible in my opinion, because as a staffer, I sit there and I wonder how they do all of this stuff, because the constraints on their time, the demands on their time back in their states, in DC when they're here, their commitments to do all sorts of things that their constituents expect that they do is it's mind-boggling. And so I think part of the reason why we don't have more collegiality, so to speak, in the Senate is because there's the process that we use to pass the most difficult things isn't dependent upon collegiality. It's not dependent on these guys knowing each other. It's dependent on powerful leaders being able to secure the support of their memberships for an agreement that they've reached with the other side. And so I think until we have a more deliberative process, you may not see more collegiality.
Hi, my name's Scott Cameron. I worked in the Senate in the 80s, and I've been on the periphery of the Senate since then. If the two leaders are increasingly more powerful or more responsible for what's going on a Senate floor, is that reflected in the increase in the size of the staff of the two leaders with respect compared to, say, the committee staff?
It's a good question. You can always speculate. But if the leadership staffs have increased, personal office staffs have increased, and committee staffs have increased. Everything's increased, right? Budgets have all increased. What's interesting, though, leadership budgets have certainly increased a lot quicker than the others as well. And they perform more functions now. And they're expected by their colleagues to perform more functions, and staff rely on them to perform more functions as well. So I think that is reflective of their more centralized role and influence in the process today.
Hi, I'm Don Harsh. I'm an intern with Senator Lee. And I just had a question real fast about if the 17th Amendment were to get repealed. I think that's the one on the states being able to vote in the senators. If that were to get repealed or put back into where the states would have the, they would be able to vote in the senators, how would that change what's going on with the senators and just everything like that? Would that change at all what you've been talking about with the whole, how everything works there with the procedures and everything?
There's certainly been a lot written on this. I think it depends on each individual state. I mean, it may reduce the time that members have to do a lot of things like fundraising and others, because it reduces the size of the electorate for some. But, there's a lot of stuff been written on that. I think you can make lots of different arguments.
I'm Joe Baldacchino, National Humanities Institute, and I have two questions that may or may not be related. I guess the first one is, this change to structured consent, did that come about primarily because, one Senate leader decided that that's how they're going to operate now, and he forces it, or was there a broader array of circumstances that sort of brought that about? I guess the question would be, could a new Senate leader simply on his own say, I'm not going to do it that way, we're going to do it this way, and change it? That's one question. And another question is, how do they enforce this? You say, in effect, the fix it in before it really even gets to the floor. What would happen if an individual senator tried to just do things more the old-fashioned way? Would they bring down, punishments on him? Or, I'm just curious as to how all this is forced. What makes it continue to happen?
This will be the last question. Well, I think first, there's no, the development of kind of new ways of doing things in the Senate doesn't occur overnight, right? It's not like there's a meeting and a bunch of members get together and they say, we're going to do things henceforth this way, and then we may still do things this way on occasion. It's a gradual adaptation of the Senate to its environment. And so what you see is as conflict rises in the Senate in the 70s and 80s, as parties become more cohesive and polarized, as the issue agenda gets more contentious, and as the workload grows, the leaders at the time, Howard Baker, Robert Byrd, struggle to figure out ways to adapt on a case-by-case basis to that environment. And as they do, you see an accumulation of a new way of doing things. And you first see a more majoritarian pattern where you basically you write a bill, either in committee or in the leader's office. You put it on the floor and you either try to pressure politically enough members to vote for it, or you entice minority support by including things they want in it. And then you kind of lock everything else down. But that becomes increasingly difficult to do as well. In fact, it was never really successful because it's really hard to do that in the Senate even today. And so they have to find a new way. And this new way, it's almost like they're struggling in the dark, right, is the structured consent. It kind of happens overnight. I mean, not overnight. It happens over time. And it's not like they're sitting there saying, well, this is going to be really bad in 6 years if we keep doing this way, right? It just, these are just things that accumulate. As for how do you enforce it, structured consent typically is embodied with a unanimous consent agreement, right? You have a pressing issue typically associated with some sort of deadline that is bearing down on the Senate. There's no committee consideration of the bill, or if there is, it's kind of perfunctory and it doesn't go anywhere. And the floor is kind of the last place. A lot of negotiations transpire among the leaders and the interested members over what this is going to look like. They take temperature of members they think they need to take the temperature of to figure out what can pass. And at the last possible minute, usually, the agreement is ratified in a unanimous consent agreement, and then that paves the way for this prearranged process on the floor that either allows for some amendments or no amendments, sets higher thresholds for amendments that may pass, sets lower thresholds for amendments that are guaranteed to lose. The goal is to create a process that doesn't jeopardize the passage of the legislation in question, because the Senate wants that to pass. And so when that happens, if you can think about, say, the fiscal cliff, for instance, this is something that the vast majority, if not all, of senators want to avoid. They disagree on how best to do it, but they all want to avoid it. At the last possible moment, when this is ratified with a deadline bearing down, it can be an extraordinarily lonely place to stand up and to object. And then you have to ask yourself, to what end? What do I gain from this? Does it affect the outcome? Do I bear some reputational concerns? Am I retaliated against in the future? And so you begin to see how the peer pressure in the social environment of the Senate, the chemical process that Senator Kennedy acknowledges in his memoir, you see how that can bear down on individual senators, and you can see how you end up getting outcomes that everyone is frustrated with generally, but yet everything still typically passes and via unanimous consent. So.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, James. This is a fascinating presentation. I'd encourage all of you to go online and order a copy of the book. Remember to use the cards that you'll be able to get outside. I believe we'll have sandwiches outside for those who are here. Thank you very much.